The audience chamber had been built to flatter power, and power, Count Dooku thought, was never so vulgar as when it insisted on being mistaken for pageantry. The room belonged to General Grievous in the legal sense, to the Confederacy in the administrative sense, and to the old Sith custom of theater in the truest one. It was an amphitheater disguised as a throne room, tall black columns ribbed with gold, crimson drapes pinned between them in a gesture towards senatorial dignity, a raised central dais where a captive might appear pitiable or important according to the arrangement of light. Beyond the long pane of curving transparent steel, the battle over Corasont flowered in hard colors. Green turbolaser fire splashed against the darkness like paint cast by an angry god. Republic cruisers rolled above the planet's city with their bellies split open. Tiny sparks of starfighters corkscrewed around larger ships already dying. Beneath it all lay the measureless skin of the capital itself, towers and traffic lanes and districts blurring together into one vast jeweled wound. The ships shuddered. A seam somewhere above them screamed. Dust drifted from the ceiling in a pale veil and settled on the shoulders of Dooku's cloak. In the chair at the center of the chamber, Supreme Chancellor Palpatine wore his captivity like another office. His wrists were locked to the armrests by mag bindings. His expression, when anyone without the Force might have seen it, was a tidy composition of strain, dignity, and fear. He had let his silver hair come loose. One side of his collar had been deliberately torn. His breathing, always so artfully managed, trembled on the edge of helplessness. Only the eyes betrayed him, and even then only to someone who knew what hunger looked like when age had taught it patience. Dooku stood with his hands loosely folded behind him and let the silence ripen. Two Magna Guards flanked the dais, their photoreceptors burning a dim predatory red. Their electrostaffs remained grounded, yet the room seemed full of poised violence anyway, as if the black floor beneath them had learned expectation from all the men who had died on it. At last Dooku said, "You enjoy this more than prudence recommends." Palpatine did not turn his head. His performance remained impeccable. "One must not take pleasure where one can find it, Count. That way lies vulgarity. Then you are slumming." The corner of the old man's mouth moved in something too faint to be called a smile. His fear returned a heartbeat later, perfectly placed. "Your wit survives every disappointment. It is one of your more admirable defects." Dooku's gaze went back to the blazing viewport. "I had not understood that I would be the evening's principal entertainment. You still assume the stage belongs to one actor at a time." There it was again, that softness under the words that was not softness at all, but the sound of a knife being tested against cloth. Palpatine never spoke plainly when he could wound by implication. That had once impressed Dooku. Later, it had bored him. In the last few months it had begun, in quiet moments, to trouble him. He had left the Jedi because he could no longer bear to watch corruption dressed as procedure. He had watched senators buy worlds with speeches about trade, watched committees delay relief until the dead were no longer politically useful, watched the order place itself between suffering and action because propriety mattered more than urgency. Sereno had called him home with the voice of old blood and older obligations. Sidious had found him already disillusioned, already half prepared to believe that only violence could cut rot from a government whose nerves had gone numb. The first lie had been the easiest one, because it had not been entirely a lie. The Republic was diseased. The Senate was a market disguised as law. The Jedi had become clerks with sabers. Dooku had needed no persuading on those points. Sidious had only offered the next step, the fatal step, the one that men who mistake clarity for virtue always take. If the old structure was rotten, then anything strong enough to break it could call itself necessary. Years later, standing above Coruscant, while millions shrieked in fire that had been budgeted, designed, and scheduled, Dooku could admit something he had never given language before. He had not followed Sidious because Sidious was wise. He had followed him because Sidious had seemed willing. The distinction had cost the galaxy dearly. He turned his head and studied the man in the chair. The force around Palpatine remained hooded, folded inward with that chilling mastery which had hidden him in plain sight for more than a decade. Yet concealment was never absence. Dooku felt him the way a swordsman felt a line under silk, not seen, not exposed, but undeniably there. Coiled, alert, waiting. Waiting for whom? He knew the answer. The answer had the shape of a blazing presence coming ever nearer through the ship's labyrinth, a furnace wrapped in youth and impatience, a power great enough to make lesser beings call it destiny. Sidious had spent years cultivating the boy, not merely befriending him, which had been obvious enough, but shaping the humiliations around him, curating his resentments, sharpening his fear of loss until it glowed like heated iron. Dooku had seen the method and admired its thoroughness. Only lately had he begun to suspect that the method did not end where he had been told it ended. He remembered the conversation on Sereno months ago, the one in which Sidious had spoken of the coming transition. The war, he said, must culminate in a crisis so grave that emergency power became permanence. The Jedi would be isolated. The Senate would kneel gratefully. Dooku, publicly disillusioned with the Confederacy's corporate excesses, would serve as the respectable aristocratic bridge into the new order. There would be reforms, yes. Prisons, yes. Exemplary trials. A temporary severity that would become habit because habit made subjects docile. And Anakin Skywalker? On that point, Sidious had been vague in a way he had never been vague before. Useful, he had said. That word had lingered. The ship jolted harder this time. Somewhere beneath them came the muffled percussion of explosions. The Magna Guards tightened their grip on their staffs. Palpatine made a sound low enough to pass for alarm. Dooku, without seeming to move, let one finger brush the control panel built into a column at his side. A ceremonial system menu opened under his fingertip. He selected the chamber's archival holocams and activated silent recording on every angle. Palpatine's eyes slid toward him at last. A precaution, Dooku said. For history? For leverage? That almost earned him a real smile. History and leverage are often siblings. So are betrayal and succession. Now the old man fully turned his gaze upon him. The fear remained on his face, but the thing behind it looked out cleanly for one bright instant, and Dooku saw his own death there the way some men saw weather in the sea. Not with certainty of date, perhaps, but with certainty of kind. This battle, this boy, this room. The script was all but visible. Anakin would arrive flushed with combat and devotion. Obi-Wan would be present because witnesses made corruption instructional. Dooku would be defeated in a manner sufficiently dramatic to gratify a young warrior's ego. Then Sidious would ask for murder, not because Dooku's death mattered strategically, but because the boy's obedience to that command mattered spiritually. It would be a lesson, and Dooku the disposable text of it. For a moment, the knowledge brought no anger, only a dry and almost scholarly surprise. So this was the famous rule of two reduced to its true arithmetic. One master, one apprentice, and whichever of them could be profitably replaced was, in effect, already dead. Then anger came, old and aristocratic and clean as drawn steel. He had tolerated much. Corporate vermin on the Separatist Council, battles prolonged past necessity, planets used as examples, men like Newt Gunray given temporary dignity because greed was useful if leashed. He had accepted ugliness in service to what he still sometimes named, in private and with diminishing conviction, a future architecture of order. But to be fed to a half-formed prodigy so that Sidious could complete one more moral maiming? No. That insult bit too close to something Dooku had never surrendered. Not to the Jedi, not to the dark side, not to the years themselves. Palpatine read the change in him. His expression never altered, but the air between them tightened. "You are thinking too loudly, my friend," he murmured. "I was remembering a lesson. From Lord Sidious. From Master Yoda." One white eyebrow rose a fraction. How quaint. Dooku looked again to the battle, and for the first time in many years, memory came without the usual layer of defensive irony. Yoda had taught him that every duel began before blades met. In posture. In breath. In the stories, each fighter carried about himself. If you knew which story your opponent needed to prove, you could lead him where you pleased. Dooku had spent decades perfecting that principle. He had used it on senators, admirals, apprentices, merchants, hired killers, and Jedi. He had believed himself too old to forget it. Yet he had nearly forgotten it with Sidious, because he had mistaken secrecy for depth. He had allowed the Sith title, Tyrannus, to narrow him into a function. He had become a man performing ruthlessness instead of the one who saw the board. No longer. He let the Force extend through the deck plating and bulkheads, through smoke and alarms and running droids, through shafts where gravity stuttered and corridors full of intermittent blaster fire. There. Two bright figures cutting upward through the ship. One steady as a river locked in stone. One furious as a forge. The first was control so disciplined that people called it mildness, and missed the strength entirely. The second was power unfinished, wounded, vain, hungry to be seen. Obi-Wan Kenobi. Anakin Skywalker. Dooku felt something else under the younger man's heat this time. Something he had not tasted clearly before. Fear. And not fear of battle. Not fear of death. Fear of losing one particular life he could not bear to imagine extinguished. Sidious had found a deeper seam than resentment. Interesting. Dangerous. He remembered another young Jedi, years ago, standing in a rain-swept field on an outer world and arguing with him about compassion. Qui-Gon Jinn had looked almost insolent when he cared too much. It was the one thing about him that had never seemed trainable. Dooku had loved that defect in him, though he had hidden it under severity. Later the Order would call that same compassion impractical. Later still, they would bury the man and go back to paperwork. Qui-Gon had once said that institutions mistook stillness for wisdom because stillness frightened fewer donors. The memory struck Dooku with such force that he nearly laughed. "What amuses you?" Palpatine asked. "The possibility," Dooku said, "that you are not the only old man in this room who knows how to improvise." The doors at the far end of the chamber boomed under a cutting charge. The Magna Guard straightened. Beyond the metal, sabers ignited with that living hum which no machine had ever adequately imitated. Blue light leaked around the seams. Palpatine drew breath and arranged terror across his face like a ceremonial sash. Dooku set his right hand on the hilt at his hip and bowed a fraction to the room, to the battle, to the dead already made useful by men above them. Then he smiled. Anakin Skywalker brought his starfighter in too hot because he always did, and because somewhere in him there lived an unexamined conviction that death, properly defied, became obedience. The ATA-2 screamed through the torn skin of battle with buzz droids chewing at the stabilizers and Republic traffic scattering before him in bright panicked swarms. R2-D2 shrilled from the socket behind the cockpit, a language of outrage, calculations, and unsolicited advice. "Try not to enjoy yourself so much," Obi-Wan Kenobi said over the comm, his own voice clipped with concentration. "It encourages bad habits." Anakin cut under the flaming corpse of a banking vulture droid and skimmed a Separatist frigate so closely that the hull lit his cockpit in a wash of cruel silver. "You say that every time I save us. I say it every time you mistake surviving for being correct." A burst of static swallowed the rest. Above them, beyond them, everywhere, Corasont spun under a siege no one had thought possible. The capital's orbital defense grid stabbed upward in disciplined emerald lines. The great senatorial district flashed with alarm beacons. Ships burned and fell. One venator rolled, venting atmosphere and men in an invisible spiral. The scale of it made even Anakin, who loved risk in the abstract, feel the first edge of sober rage. They had brought the war to the heart of the Republic. They had taken the Chancellor from under the nose of the Jedi Temple itself. Dooku had signed his own death warrant. Or so Anakin told himself. He felt the Chancellor as a weak point in the Force, a knot of distress tucked somewhere within the monstrous vessel ahead. It would have comforted him if the sensation had been cleaner. Instead, it came wrapped in something colder, something oily at the edges, like a familiar voice heard through water. He pushed the feeling aside. There would be time later to dislike mysteries. Right now there was only the mission and the hum in his blood and the memory of Geonosis, of blue blade meeting red, and an arm hitting the sand before he even understood what had happened. He still dreamed that instant sometimes. Not the pain, the surprise. "Starboard batteries are tracking you," Obi-Wan warned. "I know. Then why in all the stars are you smiling?" "Because I'm ahead of them." He rolled, dipped, clipped the firing angle by less than a meter, and came straight for the invisible hand's hanger throat, while R2 sent a burst of fire through the swarm of buzz droids chewing at his wing. Tiny Rex pinwheeled away. The hanger shields rippled and let them through. Magnetic clamps bit the landing gear almost before the engines finished screaming down. The transition from battle to corridor came like the change from storm to furnace. The ship's interior stank of ozone, hot metal, lubricant, and the thin chemical sharpness of recently discharged blasters. Battle droids converged before the cockpits had fully opened. Anakin was already moving when the canopy lifted, saber in his hand, body lighter than thought. Blue light tore across the dim hangar. Arms, rifles, and heads separated from torsos with the crisp efficiency of a master craftsman dismantling cheap toys. Obi-Wan landed beside him with the economy that always made his violence look reluctant until one noticed how complete it was. "Straight to the bridge?" Anakin asked. "Straight to the Chancellor." A super battle droid fired from the catwalk above. Obi-Wan cut the bolt back through its chest without looking up. "Do try to remember why we're here. Because you enjoy rescue work. Because the head of government has been abducted by a sadist you are entirely too eager to duel." "I'm not eager." Obi-Wan gave him a look that had survived years of war with only increased eloquence. "Anakin." "All right," Anakin said, parrying a bolt so hard the droid behind it folded backward into a second line of troops. "I'm a little eager." They ran. Corridors took them through the heaving middle body of the ship where the battle above translated into tremors underfoot. Gravity changed twice in the span of 3 junctions. A lift shaft had become a vertical road of sparks and drifting bodies. Anakin used the Force to rip open doors while Obi-Wan cut down droids with infuriating neatness, never spending more motion than the exact problem required. R2 rolled after them, complaining constantly, plugging himself into access panels whenever he could and shrieking triumph when blast doors answered to him instead of to the vessel's dying logic. At one intersection they came upon clone troopers pinned by a droidicas. Anakin hit the first destroyer on the move, carving through shield, chassis, and deck in a single overcommitted arc that somehow worked because he was Anakin. Obi-Wan slipped under the second shield line and dismantled its emitter before it could fully rotate. A young sergeant, helmet scorched down one side, saluted through smoke. "General Kenobi, General Skywalker, the upper command decks are chaos. The Seps are pulling power from everything to keep the top levels sealed." "The Chancellor is alive?" Obi-Wan asked. The sergeant hesitated. "Unknown, sir. We intercepted one transmission from the audience chamber. Couldn't decode. Sounded like..." The ship groaned so violently that the deck canted. The troopers slammed into the wall. Somewhere above them a massive system failed with a heavy finality. "Sounded like what?" Anakin snapped. "Like they weren't worried, sir." That stayed with Anakin as they ran on. Dooku worried him. Grievous enraged him. Whole fleets and battle lines and Senate debates could be reduced to problems if he stared hard enough and moved quickly enough. But there was something in the ease of the Chancellor's capture that had gnawed at him since the first report. Too clean, too central, almost theatrical. He had spent years around Palpatine, close enough to know the old man's rhythms, the pauses he used when listening, the indulgent warmth in his voice when he asked after a mission. The Chancellor liked being rescued. He liked gratitude. He liked the look on senators' faces when danger seemed to prove his indispensability. None of that made him treacherous. It made him political. Yet the unease remained. They cut through a reception antechamber where portraits had been smashed from the walls by blaster fire. A protocol droid lay dismembered under a gilded bench. Smoke drifted low and red in the emergency lighting, turning the whole passageway into the interior of a wound. Obi-Wan slowed just enough to touch Anakin's shoulder. "Listen to me." "I am listening." "No, you're preparing speeches. Put them away. Dooku will try to separate us. He'll bait you with Geonosis, with the war, with anything that tempts you into speed. Don't give him what he wants." "Me." Anakin exhaled through his teeth. "He wants to die. Then disappoint him." It was absurdly like Obi-Wan to make discipline sound like insult. Anakin almost smiled. Instead, he nodded once. They reached the final blast door. The metal had been reinforced from the other side. The seam glowed where cutting charges had already half softened it. Through the Force, beyond heat and alloy and smoke, Anakin felt 3 bright nodes in the chamber beyond. One he knew. One he hated. The third. He stopped. "What is it?" Obi-Wan asked. Anakin searched for words and found none he trusted. "The Chancellor doesn't feel afraid." Obi-Wan studied his face for a single sharp second. There was no time to excavate intuition. No time to be careful with weirdness. The mission had narrowed to a blade's width. "Then, let's go see why." They set the charges, stepped back, and waited through the short hiss of chemical burn. When the lock blew inward, light rolled out around the frame, gold and red, and the cold white from beyond the viewport. Anakin entered first, saber high, anger already finding its target. At the center of the chamber, Count Dooku stood as if he had been entertaining himself with patience and had only now chosen to look pleased. "My young friends," Dooku said, and the title came out with such dry courtesy that it was almost mockery. How punctual. Corasont burns and still the Jedi keep appointments. Palpatine twisted in the chair with convincing strain. "Anakin, Obi-Wan, thank the Force." The Chancellor's relief arrived a little too polished, Anakin thought. Then Dooku's red blade ignited with its familiar predatory hiss, and thought thinned to action. He and Obi-Wan spread without speaking, years of shared combat reducing intention to geometry. Obi-Wan took the left line, all economy and patience. Anakin drove center-right harder, lower, willing to meet Dooku at the exact place where memory hurt most. Their blue blades struck red, and the chamber changed nature all at once, turning from throne room to storm. Light strobed over columns and torn drapery. Sparks jumped. The floor rang under their feet. Dooku was still exquisite. Anakin had become stronger since Geonosis, stronger since the countless engagements that had turned his body into something war-ready and restless. Stronger since the Outer Rim sieges, the close calls, the bruising grind of command. But Dooku fought as if time itself had manners. He did not waste motion. He did not acknowledge panic. His curved hilt saber moved in narrow, elegant lines, each stroke both offense and rebuke. He turned Obi-Wan's careful pressure aside with a wrist movement so slight it seemed insulting, then pivoted into Anakin's heavier attack and bled momentum from it like a duelist taking measure of a child's temper. "Better," Dooku murmured as their blades locked. "Anger has taught you decisiveness. Pity it teaches so little balance." "Naya." Anakin shoved, broke contact, came back overhead with a strike powerful enough to split a training remote in half through shielding. Dooku met it, slid aside, and nearly took his knee. Obi-Wan intercepted blue on red in a crackling X, forcing Dooku back a pace. To anyone without training, it might have looked like a blur of color and acrobatics. To Obi-Wan, it was a conversation in increasingly dangerous grammar. Dooku was feeling for openings, yes, but more than that, he was feeling for narrative. He wanted Anakin provoked. He wanted Obi-Wan marginalized. He always had. The older man respected discipline too much not to target it first. The thought completed itself a heartbeat before Dooku changed cadence. The Count disengaged from Anakin and drove at Obi-Wan with a sequence so rapid that even experience barely made sense of it. A high feint, a low cut, a twist of the wrist, a force-backed shove hidden inside the crossing of blades. Obi-Wan blocked the first three and saw the fourth only when the force around Dooku tightened. He brought his guard down, but not enough. The invisible impact caught him center chest and hurled him backward into the foot of the dais. The edge of the platform struck his temple. White flared behind his eyes. His saber stayed in his hand by habit alone. "Obi-Wan!" Anakin's voice cracked into fury. Exactly as planned, Obi-Wan thought dimly, hating both the accuracy and the delay it imposed on his body. Anakin was on Dooku before the Count fully turned, and now the duel altered in a way that would have fascinated Obi-Wan under less catastrophic circumstances. Against two opponents, Dooku had fought like a lecturer punishing interruptions. Against Anakin alone, he became something sharper, almost eager, and that eagerness had less to do with victory than with revelation. He wanted to see what the younger man became under sufficient pressure. He was not only fighting, he was appraising. Palpatine watched from the chair with parted lips. That sight, more than the blow to his own head, dragged Obi-Wan back toward full awareness. The Chancellor's face had lost its public mask. Not entirely. Not enough for a civilian to notice, but enough for a Jedi who had spent years around him in chambers and briefings and ceremonies. Fear had thinned. In its place was anticipation so naked it chilled him even through pain. Palpatine was not horrified by the duel. He was engrossed by it. Dooku saw it too. Across the room, while defending against a whirlwind assault that would have split lesser duelists apart, the Count glanced once toward the chair. In that instant, something changed in his expression. Not on the surface. His face remained composed, severe, disdainful even. But the rhythm of his blade altered. He stopped pressing the smaller humiliations that had marked his earlier style. He ceased to enjoy himself. Anakin drove him to the edge of the dais. Their sabers spat light over Palpatine's lined cheeks. The Chancellor's eyes shone. "Good," he said softly, and then louder, in the voice he used before committees and on commemorative days. "Anakin, end this." The words struck the chamber wrong. Not because a captive asking rescue from his captor was strange. Not because war brutalized expectations. But because the tone carried no strain, no plea, none of the ragged instinct of a man whose life depended on someone else's blade. It carried instruction. Ownership. Dooku's gaze snapped to him. Anakin did not consciously notice. He was inside the duel now, inside the old damage in the years since, inside that intoxicating place where motion became morality, and every successful strike felt like a proof of self. Dooku gave ground. Anakin cut high, low, center. The Count parried twice, missed the third by a margin too narrow to trust, and lost one sleeve to the blade. Cloth spun burning to the floor. Dooku stepped back again. Anakin came in with both sabers crossing, a brutal descending bind he had once been too inexperienced to control. Dooku blocked, though barely, and for a heartbeat their faces were so near that Anakin saw every line age had carved there, every pale mark of old duels, every small aristocratic contempt the Count wore as naturally as skin. Then Dooku said very quietly, "For Anakin alone, he means to have you kill me." Anakin bared his teeth. "I'm considering it. I know. That is why I say it." "Nay." And gosh. Obi-Wan pushed himself upright, head ringing. "Anakin, don't listen." "On the contrary," Dooku said, and now his voice carried to the room. "He should begin listening. It may save him." Palpatine's features did not alter, but the temperature of the chamber seemed to drop. Anakin slammed Dooku's blade aside. "You talk too much." "Because silence," Dooku said, "has profited him long enough." He fought differently after that. Not less skillfully, not less dangerously, but with a disturbing attention to the chair behind them. He began giving Anakin lines of attack that brought the younger man squarely between Dooku and Palpatine. He drew out the exchange instead of ending it when he still might have, and each time the Chancellor spoke, each time that warm old voice sharpened into command, Dooku's certainty grew visible even to Obi-Wan. The Count had discovered something, and whatever it was, he hated it. Anakin pressed. Fury made him magnificent and sloppy at once. Dooku batted one blade wide, trapped the second for an instant, nearly took his shoulder. Missed because Anakin was too fast. Retreated up the dais, retreated again. Palpatine leaned forward as far as the bindings allowed. Gray robes pooled at his feet, eyes devouring every exchange. "Now," the Chancellor said. "Take him." Dooku laughed. Not loudly. Not with pleasure. With the clean disbelief of a man who has at last recognized the exact price another intended to make him pay. Anakin hammered both sabers down. Dooku's hilt tore free of his grip and spun across the dais in a spray of sparks. For the barest instant, the Count was unarmed. Anakin's blades crossed at his throat. Everything stopped. Even the ship seemed to hold itself between one shudder and the next. Red from the viewport bled across the polished floor. Obi-Wan got one knee under himself and stared at the tableau on the dais. Anakin breathing hard, face bright with adrenaline and anger. Dooku kneeling because the geometry of defeat had placed him there, not because humility had ever learned his bones. Palpatine in the chair behind them, eyes alight with something far hotter than relief. "Kill him," the Chancellor said. The words struck like metal on stone. Anakin's arms tightened. His jaw flexed. There were dead worlds behind him, dead clone troopers, dead Jedi. All the endless columns of grief the war had made routine. Dooku's head was between his blades. Justice, revenge, expedience. How easy it would be to name any of them and be done. Then Dooku, still kneeling, turned his face just enough that one dark eye found Anakin's. "Ask him," he said, "why he wants it so badly." There are moments in battle when the body seems to move ahead of history, and then there are moments when history leans in so close that every breath tastes of consequence. Anakin, blades poised to sever a neck, felt the second kind descend on him with suffocating weight. "Do it," Palpatine said again, softer now, intimate, almost paternal. "He deserves no mercy." Dooku's gaze never left Anakin's. "There, hear it. Not law, not necessity, appetite." "Silence," Palpatine snapped. The command cracked through the room with such naked authority that Obi-Wan's stomach turned. The Chancellor had spoken to them all in tones of request and persuasion for years. Even in emergency, he draped command in civility. This was not that voice. This was something older, something that expected obedience because it believed itself closer to the structure of reality than anyone else. Anakin heard it too. He did not lower his sabers, but uncertainty entered his expression like the first fracture in ice. Dooku took the fracture and drove a wedge into it. "Ask him about Separatist," he said. "Ask him why the clone army appeared precisely when it became useful to him. Ask him who ordered Jango Fett to Kamino. Ask him why the war has always arrived exactly where his speeches required it." Nay. Palpatine's face hardened by degrees. The fear vanished, not as a performance carelessly dropped, but as a mask deliberately removed. Anakin's eyes flicked toward the chair. "What is he talking about?" "A desperate man's inventions," Palpatine said. Even now, his public voice tried to reassert itself, wrapping denial in grandfatherly regret. "He will say anything to divide us." "Will he?" Obi-Wan said, rising fully at last, one hand pressed for an instant against the bruise spreading under his tunic. "Because he is saying things only someone very close to the truth should know." Dooku gave a thin smile. The last. Anakin did not move. His crossed blades hovered a hair's breadth from Dooku's throat. "Talk. Fast." It was perhaps the least wise sentence he could have chosen, but Dooku had not lived this long by wasting a granted audience. "My Sith name was Tyrannus," he said. "The one your Chancellor preferred when arranging crimes he wished to keep abstract. Separatist died because his death served the creation of an army which would answer not to the Republic, not to the Jedi, but to secret commands nested inside authority. Camino was not an accident. Dionysus was not an accident. The war has been a stage managed by one man wearing two faces. Palpatine's eyes became absolute cold. You overestimate how much anyone values your confession. Confession? Dooku's laugh held open contempt now. No. This is self-defense. No. Anakin finally stepped back half a pace, enough to let Dooku draw one breath without steel on his skin. Not enough to free him. You expect me to believe the Chancellor is a Sith? I expect, Dooku said, that you believe your own eyes in the next few seconds. Palpatine moved before the words finished. It was not an obvious motion, not at first. Only a minute tightening in the fingers bound to the chair, a change in the balance of the old body, a gathering of the Force so sudden and deep that every living thing in the chamber felt it at once. Obi-Wan's skin crawled. Anakin turned. Dooku kicked backward off one knee, not away from Anakin but sideways, clearing the direct line between Jedi and Chancellor. The mag bindings around Palpatine's wrists shattered outward without any visible mechanism releasing them. Metal snapped. The chair groaned. For one astonished instant the old man remained seated, his face stripped bare of all gentle habit, yellow light kindling behind the pupils. Then Dooku made his move. His empty left hand sliced through the air toward the column control panel where he had armed the chamber systems earlier. The room responded. All archival holocoms locked, recorded and transmitted to a concealed secure buffer in the ship's core. At the same instant he used the Force to wrench one of the broken restraining brackets free of the chair and hurl it, not at Palpatine's body, but at the transparasteel support beam above him. The beam cracked. The chamber lurched. Palpatine stood. No civilian bound to a chair, torn robes hanging heavy, should have been able to rise through that instability with such predatory grace. No frightened statesman should have absorbed the flying weight of a durasteel bracket with one hand, stopped it in midair, and flung it aside with contemptuous ease. No head of government should have smiled like that. Anakin stared. The old face was unchanged and changed at once. Still Palpatine. Still, the familiar folds at the mouth, the tired-lidded eyes, the high, pale brow. But the arrangement had altered. The kindness had never been kindness. It had been ownership disguised as warmth. The fatigue had been patience. The indulgence had been measurement. For a heartbeat, Anakin saw not the man who had praised his victories and listened to his frustrations, but the thing that had been listening through those years, taking the shape of trust while growing behind it. Obi-Wan's saber came up instinctively. Palpatine's sleeve spilled a hilt into his palm. Red erupted. Sidious, Dooku said, and the name landed in the chamber like a verdict. The Sith Lord's gaze flicked to him, murderous and almost admiring. Longer than expected, he said, but no less inevitable. Is it? Dooku asked. Anakin found his voice in a rasp. Chancellor. Drop the title, Obi-Wan snapped. Palpatine never looked away from Dooku. Anakin, stand aside. And there it was again. Not request. Not appeal. Command issued from the bedrock assumption that the boy belonged to him. Anakin did not move. Something black and furious passed across Sidious's face. He came off the dais like an unleashed blade. If Dooku had hoped revelation alone would save him, the next heartbeat corrected him brutally. Sidious was faster than age had any right to be, and stronger than the chair robes, public stoop, or carefully curated voice had ever suggested. Red light tore down at Dooku's head. Dooku recovered his fallen saber to hand by reflex and barely met the strike. The impact jarred his shoulder to the spine. Sidious pressed with no flourish, no elegance, only concentrated hatred sharpened by years of concealment. They crashed through a stand of ornamental metalwork and sent gilded fragments skidding across the floor. Anakin and Obi-Wan moved together because there was no world in which they could do otherwise. Blue joined red. The chamber became impossible. Sidious whirled, cloak flaring, and for one ferocious sequence all pretense died. He was not the courteous elder of committee chambers. He was not even the patient conspirator of whispered assignments and holographic half-seen councils. He was the dark side predator beneath both masks, and in motion he seemed to reject ordinary anatomy. His blade carved circles too swift for an untrained eye to track. The force around him struck like claws. One Magna-Guard lost its head and half a shoulder plate because it happened to stand in the angle of his turn. He had hidden in plain sight not by being weak, Anakin realized, but by being willing to appear less than he was for years at a time. The discovery felt like treason poured directly into his blood. "Anakin!" Obi-Wan shouted because shock got men killed faster than hatred. Anakin answered with action. Blue slammed into red. Sidious turned one strike, then two, then nearly took Anakin's face off with the return, and only Dooku's intervention saved him. The Count's blade intercepted with a spray of sparks. For the first time in his life, Anakin fought shoulder to shoulder with the man who had maimed him on Geonosis. For the first time in years, Obi-Wan saw Dooku not as a fallen enemy enclosed by politics, but as what he had once been trained to become, a Jedi master of terrible gifts, terrible pride, and terrifying intelligence. For one impossible breath, the three of them stood in the same disaster, united by necessity against the thing in the center of it. Then Sidious smiled, and the smile was full of all the futures in which he still intended to own them. Sidious fought the way plague spread, not beautifully, not honorably, but with a terrifying confidence in contamination. He turned every contact into corruption, every opening into panic. One instant he met Anakin's overhead blow with apparent strain. The next he yielded under it only to pivot through the line and send a blast of telekinetic force into Obi-Wan hard enough to buckle a column. The chamber's decorative wealth became ammunition. Gold fittings tore loose and spun like knives. Shards of transparent steel hissed across the floor. Fire spilled from a ruptured lighting conduit in blue-white arcs. Dooku had known the breadth of his master's power in theory. Theory had not prepared him for proximity unmediated by ritual. Sidious was always strongest when feeding on imbalance, and the room was full of it. Anakin's betrayal, Obi-Wan's shaken certainty, Dooku's rage, the panic of droids, the dying ship under their feet. The Sith Lord drank it all and grew sharper with each exchange. Their first forced alliance almost failed immediately. Anakin still moved with the instinct to protect the Chancellor, even though reason had already begun choking that instinct to death. Twice he hesitated a fraction when Sidious addressed him by name in that old intimate voice. Twice Dooku saw the hesitation and despised it, not because it was weakness, but because he recognized the workmanship. Sidious had made himself the recipient of the young man's reflexive loyalty, long before he ever planned to claim his obedience openly. "Anakin," Sidious said as their blades bound in a shriek of red and blue, "do not let him deceive you. He seeks only to replace me." "Is that all?" Dooku asked, cutting for the Sith Lord's wrist. Sidious spun away. "Would you call it false?" Dooku had no answer he cared to give within earshot of the Jedi. Obi-Wan re-entered the exchange with that precise timing which always made his presence feel less like addition than correction. He closed the angles Sidious had opened, his blade a disciplined bar of blue that denied line after line. For a moment Dooku saw beneath the beard and the wear of war, the ghost of his own lost apprentice's influence in the younger man's defense. Not himself. Never himself. But Qui-Gon, yes. The same refusal to confuse serenity with passivity. The same dangerous patience. The recognition cut deeper than he expected. Sidious felt it. Of course he did. He moved to exploit it immediately, driving a vicious flurry at Obi-Wan that forced the younger man back toward the cracked viewport. Dooku intervened, red on red, and took a glancing slash across the left forearm for his trouble. Heat bit through cloth. The smell of scorched fabric flashed up sharp and bitter. "You surprise me," Sidious said, pressing him. "Sentiment at your age?" "Memory," Dooku answered. "Worse." Anakin came in low, both blue sabers striking with heavy asymmetry, the style Obi-Wan hated and battlefield reality had honed. Sidious gave ground for the first time. Only a step. only a smooth adjustment around a broken chair support, but Dooku felt the current change. Together they could press him. Not safely, not elegantly, but genuinely. Sidious realized it in the same instant. He abandoned the blade. The red saber snapped through one final arc and vanished back into his sleeve on a magnetic draw as both hands came free. Darkness gathered around his fingers with the intimacy of old habit. Lightning erupted. There were forms of pain a lightsaber cauterized before the mind could fully register them. Sith lightning was not among them. It was violation made electrical. Nerves turned inside out. Muscles becoming traitors to bone. The blast forked wide enough to take both Jedi. Anakin crossed his sabers on instinct and caught the mainstream, but the force of it drove him to one knee. Obi-Wan twisted aside, absorbing only the edge, yet even that edge left him gasping. Dooku took the side lash across his already wounded arm and shoulder and smelled his own flesh burn beneath the sleeve. Sidious laughed. The sound was not loud. It was worse than loud. It was delighted. "You see?" he said. "The galaxy always preferred a strong hand. It begged for one. The Senate begged. The Jedi begged. Even you, Dooku, begged, though you wrapped it in philosophy." Dooku forced himself upright through the pain. "No, Da. I asked for order. You asked for worship." "No, Kata. Order is worship with better manners." Anakin shoved forward through the lightning, face contorted, jaw set so hard the muscles stood out like cables. The reflected blue-white glare turned his eyes almost silver. It was a feat of raw will more than wisdom, the kind of feat that killed as often as it prevailed, and Dooku saw Sidious's pleasure sharpen even in resistance. The old monster loved the boy most when he suffered usefully. Then Sidious changed targets. It happened with the cruel intelligence of a hunter choosing the weaker flank. The lightning snapped aside from Anakin and lanced toward Obi-Wan. Dooku moved before thought completed itself. He caught the full discharge on his blade and body, screamed despite himself, and for one hideous second the world narrowed to bone-deep fire. Obi-Wan stared at him. Not with gratitude, with shock, as if the universe had broken a smaller law inside the larger catastrophe. Dooku, shaking, forced the lightning offline and said through clenched teeth, "Do not waste the moment." That, more than anything else, seemed to restore Obi-Wan. He came forward in a sudden clean line of Soresu defense, turning the battlefield back into structure. Anakin recovered beside him and added fury where Obi-Wan supplied design. Sidious took up the saber again, because even he could not afford to disdain steel under that much coordinated pressure. The duel that followed would have horrified any student allowed to witness it, because it violated the purity every school pretended battle could keep. There was no single form, no elegant doctrinal superiority. Dooku's Makashi precision stabbed into openings Obi-Wan created by refusing them. Anakin's G-gem so transformed defense into hammering reprisal. Sidious answered with speed and ferocity bordering on chaos, yet chaos so intelligent it looped back toward pattern. He drove them across the chamber and up the dais, down again through toppled statuary, over the shattered frame of the Chancellor's chair. At one point, all four sabers, three visible, one briefly hidden, crossed in a shrieking cage of color while outside the viewport a Republic cruiser died in blooming orange silence. The ship beneath them was failing. Gravity stuttered. Artificial atmosphere thinned and recovered. Somewhere deeper in the invisible hand, fuel lines had ignited. Sirens climbed and fell in overlapping sequences like desperate choir voices. And still Sidious smiled. "You cannot win this," he said, turning Dooku's thrust and slamming a palm into Anakin's chest with enough dark force to send him skidding through sparks. "You are all already mine. The army, the Senate, the courts, the fear." Obi-Wan cut him off with a high strike that should have taken the head if not for monstrous reflexes. Sidious bent under it and countered so fast that Obi-Wan lost a strip of beard to the red edge. "The clones," Dooku said, circling. "What have you buried in them?" Sidious's gaze flashed. "There." A nerve touched. Anakin looked from one to the other. "What does he mean?" Sidious's expression smoothed instantly. He means to distract you. The army exists to defend the Republic. Does it? Dooku asked. Or to obey a command no one else knows is there? Obi-Wan's heartbeat seemed to stumble. Too many unanswered questions from too many battlefields linked themselves at once. Kamino's secrecy, Sifo Dyer's, the suspicious convenience of everything. He could not prove it. He did not need proof to feel dread. Sidious saw the realization travel across their faces and decided to break the line another way. He feinted low at Dooku, spun past Obi-Wan, and drove straight at Anakin with a speed that could only have been chosen for intimacy. Red and blue collided inches from Anakin's face. The Sith Lord leaned close enough for breath to mingle. "There is someone you fear losing," he said softly, so softly that only Force-sensitive ears could catch it. "And the Jedi will not save her." Anakin froze, only for the width of a heartbeat. Long enough. Sidious's next strike would have opened him from collar to hip if Dooku had not intercepted. Their sabers locked. Dooku felt the shock of Anakin's private terror in the Force, and understood at once that Sidious had another chain around the boy, one deeper than ambition. Useful indeed. What Dooku understood next came not from Sidious but from himself, and it was uglier. He could use that fear too. Not now. Not crudely. But later, perhaps, if the game survived the room. The thought revolted him because it was practical. He almost missed the next cut. Sidious drove him back across the broken steps of the dais, all warmth stripped from his face now, all public grace consumed. "You were always merely transitional," he said. A blade to carve out space for better instruments. Dooku gave ground deliberately, guiding the Sith Lord toward the weakened support beam he had cracked earlier. "Every master thinks that," he said, right until the moment he discovers he was visible. Obi-Wan understood first. He shifted. Anakin, still shaken, followed on instinct. Sidious noticed too late that all three of them were no longer pressing randomly but steering. They were driving him toward the chair, toward the place where his masks had broken, toward the evidence. The Sith Lord's fury darkened the air itself. There are alliances forged by treaties, alliances forged by blood, and alliances forged by the simple refusal to let a greater evil survive the room. This was the third kind, and therefore the most unstable. Dooku had spent years teaching Grievous how to use fear as weapon and pacing. He had spent years studying the Jedi's battlefield habits so that every confrontation might be bent a degree more profitably toward collapse. He knew exactly how fragile this temporary confluence was. Obi-Wan trusted neither his motives nor his soul. Anakin trusted no one at all at the moment, least of all himself. If Sidious broke their focus even once, suspicion would do the rest for him. So Dooku abandoned pretense. "Kenobi," he snapped. Voice sharp with old command, left shoulder. He favors the return through the right hip when enraged. Obi-Wan did not pause to resent the instruction. He moved. Sidious's next spinning cut met blue exactly where Dooku had predicted. Sparks flew. Anakin hammered from the opposite flank, forcing the Sith Lord to spend power where he would rather have spent cunning. "Anakin," Obi-Wan said, equally without softness, "stop chasing his blade. Take his balance." It was an almost parental rebuke, and under other circumstances Anakin might have bristled. Now, the familiarity steadied him. He shifted stance, let Sidious feints pass without overcommitting, and drove instead at the underlying motion of the older man's body. The change cost Sidious space. Not much. Enough. Dooku saw the shape of the next few seconds and trusted it like mathematics. He came in with a sequence from Makashi so classical the Jedi Temple archives probably still used it in advanced instruction, though no one alive there would imagine he retained it with such murderous clarity. Sidious answered the textbook line perfectly. Dooku wanted him to. Obi-Wan closed the route to the left. Anakin cut the retreat to the rear. For one compressed instant, Sidious stood where every path forward contained someone else's blade. He did what he always did when structure threatened him. He broke structure. The floor detonated. Not literally. The deck plating had not been mined. But Sidious drove both hands down with a telekinetic pulse so vicious that cracked seams burst open and sections of ornamental metalwork heaved skyward. The dais split. A slab of polished flooring rose like a kicked shield and smashed Obi-Wan off his feet. Anakin leaped clear. Dooku rode the shock poorly and nearly lost his saber. Then gravity failed. The chamber tilted into nightmare. Loose debris lifted in a slow, malignant drift. Torn drapes floated like blood in water. Shards of broken columns spun past faces and blades. Through the cracked viewport, Corasont canted impossibly as the invisible hand's own violent maneuvers and system failures fought over orientation. Sidious moved through the chaos as if born to it. His boots barely touched the deck. He darted between floating wreckage, red blade whispering murder. Anakin parried in a three-dimensional frenzy, propelled as much by instinct as training. Obi-Wan, slower to recover from the earlier impact, anchored himself with one hand to a broken chair brace and fended off a killing thrust by less than the breadth of his beard. Dooku used the weightlessness to advantage, turning Makashi's narrow lines into drifting cuts that required almost no footing. For a dozen heartbeats, the duel became a constellation, fighters colliding and rebounding amid debris and lightning and widening cracks in the chamber wall. Every impact sent sound strangely sideways. Every breath felt thinner. Somewhere alarms were still sounding, but they seemed now like noises from another reality. Dooku saw Obi-Wan adrift near a rupture where atmosphere was beginning to whisper outward through a hairline seam. Sidious saw him too. The Sith Lord's hand opened. A jag of twisted metal, torn from the dais, shot toward the Jedi's exposed spine. Dooku cut it in half before he had consciously chosen. The halves pinwheeled away into vacuum-thin hiss. Obi-Wan caught Dooku's eyes across the floating debris field. Confusion, anger, and something more reluctant than either passed there. "If you survive this," Obi-Wan said through clenched teeth, "I still intend to arrest you." Dooku inclined his head almost courtly. Survive first. Moral housekeeping later. Anakin would have laughed under any other sun. Instead, he rammed forward through a spinning length of broken statuary and crashed into Sidious with such force that both went tumbling across the chamber. The Sith Lord twisted midair, landed against a wall panel, and unleashed lightning at point-blank range. It hit Anakin full across the chest and cybernetic arm. The young Jedi arched in agony, a cry tearing out of him raw and shock. The mechanical hand spasmed violently, fingers locking. Something murderous and almost paternal went hot in Obi-Wan's throat. He lunged. Sidious was ready. Red met blue. The collision flared like a star. Dooku reached Anakin first. The younger man was half stunned, smoke rising from the blackened glove of his artificial hand. Beneath the pain, beneath the rage, his fear lay naked in the Force now that Sidious had named it. Dooku felt the shape of a woman there, not merely beloved but necessary, central to the boy's idea of meaning. So that was the Axis. So that was why the Chancellor had taken such keen interest in confidences and comforts, why his mentorship had the softness of a hook wrapped in claw. "You must stand," Dooku said. Anakin bared his teeth. "I know." "No, you do not. If you fall now, he will use your corpse to poison the galaxy." "No, The words were cruel enough to cut through fog. Anakin looked up. Dooku offered no hand. He simply stepped into line and blocked the next blast of lightning that would have taken the young man's head. Anakin rose. The room righted itself with a nauseating lurch as gravitic systems partially recovered. Everyone slammed hard to some approximation of down. Obi-Wan rolled, regained footing, and instantly called, "Center!" Old battlefield reflex overrode disbelief. Anakin took right. Dooku took left. Sidious stood amid the ruin of the Chancellor's chair, cloak torn, one sleeve burned open, face lit from below by fire chewing up through the broken floor. For the first time, something like strain touched him. Not fear, Not yet. But effort. You should have remained what I made you, he said to Dooku. An instrument. And you, Dooku said, should have learned the danger of educating aristocrats. He meant it as insult. It landed, unexpectedly, as truth. He had spent years pretending his birth no longer shaped him, because the dark side had offered a new nobility based on power rather than line. But line mattered. Not because it entitled, because it remembered. Dooku of Sereno had been taught from childhood that humiliation required answer, that public diminishment invited further theft, that men who mistook service for ownership eventually found their households at war. Sidious had counted on hunger and underestimated pride. It might yet save him. Sidious attacked Anakin again. Of course he did. Not because Anakin was the weakest fighter. He wasn't, not when rage sharpened him. But because Anakin was the hinge upon which too many futures swung. Sidious's red blade rained down in savage precision. Anakin met it with both sabers, every clash ringing off the chamber walls. The young man fought now with something colder threaded through his fury. Betrayal had burned away the last vestiges of courtly deference. He saw no Chancellor anymore. Only the monster who had watched him grow and measured where to insert the knife. Was any of it real? He demanded between blows. Any of it. Sidious's answer came as a hissed strike that cut through Anakin's sleeve and drew first blood. It was useful. The words nearly did what the blade had not. Anakin's control surged into pure wrath. Obi-Wan felt it and moved to bracket, to contain, to stop the boy he loved from becoming too much like the thing before them. Dooku felt it too, and against his better judgment, admired the terrible beauty of the power unfolding. If Sidious had meant to ripen him, he had. But ripe fruit bruised. Sidious overreached, pressing the psychological wound while the physical battle demanded economy. He had always trusted his insight into weakness too much. Dooku saw the line open and stepped through it with the old discipline the Jedi had once praised in him. Makashi was not built for berserking attrition. It was built for decision. One angle, one displacement, one correction of an enemy's certainty. He cut at Sidious's saber wrist. Sidious withdrew in time, but the withdrawal took him exactly where Obi-Wan's blade was already closing. Obi-Wan's strike was not meant to kill. It was meant to deny. It did. Sidious redirected, and in redirecting, left his shoulder open to Anakin's descending hammer blow. Blue hit red, slid, bit cloth and flesh. Sidious's snarl became something uglier. Lightning burst from his free hand uncontrolled, crawling up Anakin's blades and along the steel-bright edges, filling the air with the stink of scorched metal and burning dust. The force of it drove everyone backward. Dooku hit a column hard enough to crack stonework veneer. Obi-Wan went to one knee again. Anakin, impossibly, kept advancing through the storm, face twisted, voice wordless. That was when Dooku knew the room would not end in one clean victory. It would end in damage. The question was only whose. He also knew something else with unpleasant clarity. If Sidious survived these next moments, none of them ever would. "Kenobi!" Dooku called. Obi-Wan looked up. The chair. Understanding flashed. The broken restraint frame still jutted from the dais where Palpatine's captivity had been staged. Its maglocks live, its metal supports half fused by saber strikes and lightning. Sidious stood almost atop it, too consumed with Anakin to value the hazard. Obi-Wan thrust the force through the frame's control nodes. Sparks erupted. Magnets screamed alive. Sidious's boots slammed to the metal dais. For less than a second, but less than a second was enough. Anakin crossed both sabers and drove the Sith Lord backward. Sidious parried, furious, anchored by the magnetic trap and therefore fractionally slower to evade. Dooku left the column in a burst of speed that age had not taken, only taught him not to waste. Sidious saw him coming and smiled with black hatred. "Ah," he said. "At last." Sidious's final mistake was that he still believed revelation had to serve him because it always had before. He believed that if the masks fell, Everyone would simply reassemble themselves into the next version of his design. Dooku read the assumption in his eyes and felt no pity for it. Anakin's crossed blades trapped Sidious high. The maglocks shrieked and held the Sith Lord's stance a fraction wider than he preferred. Obi-Wan, recovering from the control strike, cut low and forced Sidious to split attention downward. In that splintered instant, Dooku stepped inside the radius of the red blade, so close he smelled the burnt wool of Palpatine's robes and the bitter copper tang of old man's blood. Makashi, at its purest, was a geometry of economy. No flourish, no anger, no need to prove power through spectacle. Only line, timing, and the precise exploitation of an opponent's misplaced certainty. Dooku thrust. The curved hilt rode under Sidious' guard. Past the elbow he could not fully retract. Through layered robe and flesh, between ribs, into the heart. The blade came out through the back of the torn garment, and into the ruined frame of the Chancellor's chair, pinning Sith Lord to the stage he had built for another man's execution. For one impossible heartbeat, everything held. Sidious's yellow eyes dropped to the blade in his chest, then lifted to Dooku's face. There was surprise there, yes, but not the surprise of death. Death he had always treated as the common tax on lesser beings. This was the surprise of contradiction. The universe had not obeyed his model. An instrument had ceased to be one. Dooku leaned close enough that only Sidious could hear the words. You mistook patience for obedience. Then he withdrew the blade. Sidious sagged against the chair, mouth opening on what might have been a curse or command. Lightning flickered once, erratic, and died in his fingertips. The red saber slipped from his hand. His body struck metal with a hollow sound indecently ordinary for the death of so much hidden history. Silence followed. Not complete silence. The ship was still failing. Fire still ate at circuitry below the dais. Sirens still wailed somewhere aft. But within the Force, a pressure eased. Not vanished. The dark side never vanished. Yet the specific cloaking weight that had lain across Corasont for years like a hand over a mouth loosened with the suddenness of a blade removed from flesh. Far away, Yoda would feel it. In some corridor, perhaps a Jedi youngling would look up from lessons and find the air changed. Senators would keep talking for minutes before they understood they were no longer being arranged around a hidden center. The galaxy would not know what had happened here until someone chose the story. But the Force knew already. Anakin stumbled back first. He stared at the body pinned to the chair frame and seemed younger than he had any right to after 3 years of war. He's dead, he said. And it was not triumph. It was the bewilderment of discovering that something vast and personal had ended in front of him while he still did not understand what it had been. Obi-Wan's saber remained lit. He looked from the corpse to Dooku and back again. Drop your weapon. Dooku almost smiled. The Jedi recovered quickly. Always back to procedure, he said, though not unkindly. Drop it. Dooku considered the room. Sidious dead. Anakin shocked. Obi-Wan recovering authority. Chamber recording secured if the buffer remained intact. Ship nearing catastrophic failure. Grievous still aboard. Countless Separatist officers awaiting instruction they did not yet know had changed hands. If Dooku surrendered here, perhaps he lived long enough for a trial. Perhaps he even spoke some useful truths before execution. The Confederacy would fracture at once. Corporate cowards would flee. Grievous would rage without strategy. The Senate, terrified and leaderless, might fall into Jedi emergency control or another opportunist's hands before the truth could be properly wielded. Sidious's structures would not vanish just because his body had. Power hated vacuums less than men did. And Dooku, if he was honest, had no wish at all to spend the remainder of his life as a chained exhibit for the order he had left. No, he said. The word had barely left him when the chamber doors blew inward. Battle droids poured through first. Blasters raised. Behind them came General Grievous, cloak half torn away, metal talons scraping the floor, yellow eyes narrowing as they took in the room. His gaze moved over Anakin, Obi-Wan, Dooku, the dead body in the chair. Then it stopped. Grievous knew Palpatine only as a political asset, and Sidious only as an unseen sovereign passing through coded orders and holographic command. Yet a creature built largely from fear recognized catastrophe when it saw one. "What have you done?" he hissed. Dooku stepped between the Jedi and the corpse by reflex of ownership rather than defense. "Changed a war." The cyborg's taloned hands flexed. "The Chancellor was Sidious." Dooku did not soften it. "He is dead. If you choose confusion, die with it. If you choose obedience, secure the chamber archive and prepare my shuttle." Grievous looked at the body again. He was a killer, not a politician, but he understood hierarchy. He also understood that Dooku, scorched though he was, still held the only coherent will in the room, not stunned by revelation. Obi-Wan took a step forward. "Grievous, stand down." Grievous laughed, a rattling metallic cough of contempt. "Jedi, you have lost your Chancellor and your illusion in a single hour. I think I shall keep my footing." Kaka. The battle droids opened fire. Anakin and Obi-Wan moved together, instinct restored by immediate threat. Blue light turned the first volley back into smoking torsos and ruined rifles. Dooku did not join the attack against the Jedi, though the opportunity stood before him. Instead, he reached past the melee with the Force, seized the chamber buffer crystal in its hidden slot behind the column, and pulled it into his hand. The data chip slapped into his palm, warm from recording. Leverage. Grievous saw the motion and understood enough. He signaled retreat to the droids nearest him with a curt chopping gesture. "The ship is falling apart," he said. "We withdraw now?" "Agreed," Dooku said. Obi-Wan heard the coordination, and his expression hardened into the bleak kind of anger only betrayal by reality itself can make. "Anakin!" He meant pursue, stop them, end this before it left the room. But the invisible hand chose that moment to convulse. The deck heaved so violently that everyone went down, or grabbed for purchase. The cracked viewport split another meter with a scream like metal crying out in a human throat. Atmosphere began to vent in earnest. Fire geysered from the broken floor. Somewhere deeper in the flagship, engines misfired into a catastrophic sequence. Grievous was already moving for the side access corridor that led toward emergency craft. Dooku looked once toward the Jedi. Anakin had regained his feet, but was helping Obi-Wan up with one arm. The younger man's mechanical hand still twitched erratically from the lightning. Neither was in a position to cross the room before decompression made the question academic. "Remember what you saw," Dooku said to Anakin. Then to Obi-Wan. "Ask harder questions." He turned and went with Grievous through smoke and alarms, and the strobing red collapse light of a ship too proud to die quietly. The emergency passage beyond the chamber was narrower than Grievous preferred, and lower than Dooku's dignity appreciated. Heat breathed through the walls. Battle droids rushed past with crates, data cores, weapons, and pure panic. One tactical droid tried to demand chain of command clarification. Grievous cut it in half without slowing. In the hangar, the air was thick with fuel vapor and burned wiring. Fires climbed the supports in snarling blue columns. A shuttle waited, ramped down, engines warming. Dooku's left sleeve hung charred from elbow to cuff. His hand beneath it trembled once before he curled the fingers closed around the buffer crystal and the hilt of Sidious' fallen red saber, which he had taken without quite deciding to. Grievous turned on him near the ramp. If he was Sidious, then every order, every campaign. Yes, you served him. So did you. The cyborg's stare sharpened. You knew. I knew enough. Not all. Not this. Dooku lifted the data crystal slightly. What matters is not purity, General. It is sequence. The Republic does not yet know its Chancellor died as a Sith. The Jedi know, but knowledge without narrative is only panic. We will provide the narrative. Grievous hated narrative. It smelled too much like politics. And the war. Continues, Dooku said. Only now it may be one. The shuttle floor vibrated under the first surge of emergency launch systems. Outside the hangar shields, stars wheeled sickly as the invisible hand lost more control. Dooku looked once through the fire toward the unseen audience chamber where a dead old man sat in the wreck of his own performance. A strange emptiness moved through him then, not grief and not relief. He had imagined, in the bitter private theater of resentment, what killing Sidious might feel like if it ever became possible. Vindication, ecstasy, freedom. What he felt instead was responsibility rushing in to occupy the place where fear had been. "Launch," he said. The shuttle rose into a sky full of burning metal and began to leave the dying flagship behind. The escape from the chamber had no shape memory would later trust. There were corridors collapsing in sequence, battle droids firing from smoke, a lift that became a vertical slide because gravity failed halfway down, R2-D2 appearing out of steam and sparks like a small indignant saint, and at every turn the vast animal death throes of the invisible hand turning decisions into reflex. Sidious's corpse remained behind. There had been no time, no feasible path, no world in which dragging the body of the Chancellor through a disintegrating flagship would have preserved anyone. Yet Anakin felt the abandonment like unfinished business clawing at his spine. Obi-Wan, pale under soot, recovered enough command to make the rest survivable. "Bridge," he said when options narrowed to none. "If the ship still answers to anything, it will answer there." Anakin might have argued under ordinary strain. Under extraordinary strain, he simply nodded. They fought their way upward with a brutality stripped of style. The revelation in the chamber had taken something from both of them. Not skill, but innocence about where hatred properly belonged. Every battle droid they cut down seemed less like an enemy and more like delay imposed by a dead man's contingency. Sidious's voice still lived in Anakin's ears. It was useful. No reprimand he had ever received had gone so deep. He could not stop hearing every past kindness in reverse, all warmth translated into inventory. At one shattered junction they nearly lost Obi-Wan to a breach. Atmospheric pressure ripped a squad of droids screaming soundlessly into space. Anakin caught his former master's wrist with the good hand and anchored himself to a buckled conduit, while R2 sealed an emergency bulkhead from the far side with triumphant profanity. When at last the suction died, Obi-Wan hung panting over darkness. "Tell me," he said between breaths, "that all your insistence on refusing rest has finally made you impossible to kill." Anakin hauled him upright. "You first." They reached the bridge half by luck and half by the Force. Dead crew littered the approach, Nemoidians and droids and one clone officer who must have made it farther than the rest before being cut down. Consoles spat sparks. The forward transparisteel was cracked in a spiderweb that turned the city below into fractured jewels. Fires burned in recessed pits where control stations had overloaded. The great vessel was descending too fast, too crippled, and at the wrong angle. "No Chancellor to rescue this time," Obi-Wan said, sinking into the co-pilot station with a wince that admitted more pain than the joke. "How disappointing." Anakin stared at the controls. He was never there to rescue. The words sat between them. Obi-Wan did not answer immediately. He began pulling up what flight systems remained, jaw tight, eyes flicking over a storm of warning glyphs. "No," he said at last. He wasn't. Anakin took the pilot's chair. The command surfaces fought him at once. The invisible hand was not a nimble starfighter one could coax through instinct and audacity. It was a dying city section with engines. Whole subsystems no longer existed. One engine cluster flared too hard while the opposite bank sputtered into near silence. Stabilizers answered, late or not at all. And below them lay Corasont, a world composed almost entirely of people who would die in the tens of thousands if he failed. No pressure, he thought wildly, and almost laughed. "R2, he said. "Anything?" The astromech plugged in and gave a stream of diagnostics so appalling they transcended panic and became farce. Obi-Wan translated the gist with steady misery. He says we are flying an argument against engineering. Helpful. Also, on fire. Anakin gripped the controls and pulled. The flagship responded like a beast with broken bones. Outside, the city rushed up in tilted magnificence. Endless towers, traffic lanes boiling into emergency reroutes. The silver ribbon of airspeeders scattering from the projected fall path. Anti-collision sirens beginning to pulse across districts. Hollow screens on rooftops and public squares would be showing their ship already, he knew. Citizens would be turning faces upward. Senate aides, temple initiates, mechanics on night shifts. Children too young to understand warfare, except as sound. Everyone would be watching the burning wreck of the enemy flagship descend with the missing Chancellor, somewhere inside it or not. Anakin clenched his jaw and brought the nose around. For a few savage seconds, the great cruiser obeyed. Then a secondary engine blew out in a blossom of orange, and the whole vessel rolled. Obi-Wan's hands blurred over emergency vectors. R2 screamed. The world outside became City Skyfire City again. Anakin forced the controls down with both hands, pain sparking through the still damaged mechanical wrist. "Hold together," he growled at the ship, as if command tone mattered to metal. A laugh escaped Obi-Wan, genuine and disbelieving. "I sometimes think you were born under a prophecy composed entirely of unreasonable instructions. Not helping. No, but possibly distracting you from terror. It's working." They came in over the industrial districts, clipped a comms tower with the starboard ventral fin, and lost another flood of burning debris. Airspeeders scattered below like startled fish. Emergency repulsor teams rose to meet them but could do little more than clear lanes and pray. Anakin spotted a broad maglev track corridor opening toward a comparatively empty avenue network and aimed for it. The landing, if mercy insisted on the word, was a controlled catastrophe. The invisible hand struck, screamed, skidded, tore through guide pylons, and came apart in stages that seemed to last forever. Fire sheeted past the bridge. Durasteel shrieked. The cockpit canopy went white with sparks, and then black with smoke, and then clear enough to show the city still somehow existing beyond the ruin. At last, the ship stopped trying to become a meteor and resigned itself to being wreckage. Anakin sat frozen over the dead controls for one heartbeat. 2 hours. Obi-Wan exhaled. "Next time," he said faintly. "We save the politician first and the starship second." Agreed. Rescue teams swarmed them before they fully emerged. Clone medics, Corasont security, Senate Guard detachments, firefighting units. Faces looked up at Anakin with awe and relief until they saw the emptiness where the Chancellor should have been. Then relief curdled into dread. "General Skywalker," said a Senate Guard captain, helmet under one arm, voice rough with smoke and urgency. "The Chancellor." Anakin climbed down from the ruined access ladder and felt every eye on him. "He's dead," he said. The words did not seem to enter the world properly. They hung there, impossible and plain. Obi-Wan came down behind him more slowly, one hand pressed to his ribs. Soot striped his face. In his other hand he carried the red lightsaber he had taken from the chamber floor before escape, its hilt blackened near the emitter. He covered it with his sleeve out of instinct more than strategy, but several of the nearest troopers saw anyway and stiffened. "Get us to the temple," Obi-Wan said. "Now." The ride through the city passed in flashing fragments. Sirens parted traffic ahead of them. Holono screens bloomed on building faces with rotating headlines. Chancellor missing, enemy flagship downed. Jedi heroes return. None yet knew the true sequence. None knew that the crisis had already grown stranger than public language. As the speeder crossed the high routes toward the temple district, Anakin looked out over Coruscant and felt the shroud changed. Not gone, but frayed. The city seemed for the first time in years less muffled by a presence he had never consciously named. Underneath that came another sensation, worse in its way. Instability everywhere. Senate panic. Military confusion. Dooku alive. Grievous loose. The architect dead. The machinery still running. At the temple landing platform, Mace Windu waited with several masters, his expression carved from the kind of self-control that looked almost inhuman until one noticed how tightly it was being held. Yoda stood beside him, small against the height of the city and somehow larger than all of it. Anakin had seen the Grand Master grave before. He had never seen him look old. They approached without ceremony. There was no room left for it. "Well?" Mace said. Obi-Wan drew the red saber from within his robe and laid it across both palms. Palpatine was a Sith Lord. The night wind over Corasont seemed to stop. Yoda closed his eyes. "Felt it, I did," he said softly. "End of a shadow, birth of more." Mace's gaze moved to Anakin, then to the weapon, then back. "Tell me everything," he said. Anakin opened his mouth and found that the hardest part was not saying the Chancellor was dead. It was saying, out loud, that for years he had trusted him. The council chamber took the revelation badly, which was another way of saying it took it like sane people. Masters who had spent years breathing the same air as Palpatine now sat under the open dome with stunned fury held behind training. The red saber lay across the central platform like an accusation. Obi-Wan gave the sequence cleanly despite pain. The duel, the command to execute Dooku, the Count's accusation, Palpatine's self-revelation, the fight, Sidious' death, Dooku's escape. Anakin filled in what Obi-Wan had not seen, though certain parts came out like splinters under the tongue. "He told me to kill Dooku," Anakin said, not looking at anyone. "After the Count was beaten, it wasn't combat, it was..." He stopped. "Execution," Mace said. Anakin's jaw tightened. "I didn't do it." "No?" Obi-Wan said immediately. "He didn't." Mace was not accusing. He was inventorying. Yet the distinction offered little comfort. Yoda listened with his eyes half closed, old hands folded, as if hearing not only their voices but the echoes behind them. When Obi-Wan repeated Dooku's warning about the clone army and hidden commands, the Grand Master's ears lowered slightly. "Too much convenience there has always been," Yoda said. "Blind we were, perhaps not to darkness itself, but to the shape it wore. We need Palpatine's private files sealed before the Senate can sanitize anything," Mace said. "We need access to military command architecture, emergency power authorizations, Chancellor-level overrides, everything." "Maz Amedda will resist," said Ki-Adi-Mundi. "Then he can resist from a cell." "Caution," Yoda said, and the single word held the room. "Panic in the Senate. Already there is. Seize too much, too quickly, and confirm Dooku's accusations we may." Mace turned sharply. "If Dooku accuses us of anything, he's speaking as a butcher trying to climb over a corpse." "True," Obi-Wan said. "Also insufficient." Silence followed that because no one liked the implication. Dooku's motives were corrupt, self-serving and drenched in blood. None of that prevented him from wielding true information. The chamber recording, if he had it, could become weapon as easily as evidence. Anakin sat very still through the rest of the exchange. Outwardly, he was composed enough. Inwardly, every new angle worsened the fracture. Palpatine's death had removed the immediate source of betrayal, but not its effects. The Chancellor had known about Padme. Somehow, through instinct or surveillance or force-sick intuition, he had known exactly where to press. The secret that mattered most to Anakin had been visible to the man he had trusted. The realization made privacy itself feel childish. When the meeting finally dispersed into ordered panic, teams assigned to the Senate District, to the Chancellor's office, to military intelligence, to Camino transmission audits, Anakin asked permission to leave for 1 hour. Mace began to object. Yoda lifted a hand. "Go," the old master said, studying him with a gentleness that almost broke the young man where fury had not. "But return." Padme Amidala opened the apartment door before he could signal. She must have been waiting just beyond it, sensing the presence she knew even through all the noise in him. Coruscant's night poured silver and amber through the long windows behind her. She wore no senatorial splendor now, only a soft dark gown, her hair partly unbound, the look in her eyes already asking the question headlines had not answered. He stepped inside, and whatever rehearsed sentence he had carried there disintegrated. "He's dead," Anakin said. For one suspended moment she did not know which man he meant. Then she understood from his face. Padme closed the door quietly behind him. "Palpatine." He nodded. She crossed the space between them and touched his burned sleeve, his cheek, finally the rigid metal hand half hidden in the folds of his robe. "Are you hurt?" "Yes," he said, and because it was Padme, because she had no use for evasions, he added, "Not the part that matters." Her fingers tightened around his mechanical wrist. "Tell me." So he did, though not all at once. He told her of the duel, of Dooku kneeling, of the order to kill. He told her the Chancellor had been Sidious. He told her about the lightning, the fight, the impossible collapse of every reassuring memory into manipulation. He did not tell her at first that Sidious had spoken of her. She drew that from him anyway, because she knew his silences better than most people knew words. "He said there's someone I'm afraid to lose," Anakin said, staring past her toward the lights below. "He said the Jedi wouldn't save her." Padme went very still. "And you think he meant me?" "I know he did." "Because you told him?" "No." He shook his head, anger rising again because the ignorance humiliated him. "Because he always knew too much. He always knew when I was hiding something. When I was angry. When I felt—" He cut himself off. "I never said it. Not directly. Not enough." Padme searched his face. Then he watched, or guessed, or used the Force. None of those make him all-knowing, Anakin. Only invasive. He laughed once without humor. "That's supposed to comfort me. It's supposed to remind you that monsters feel larger when they are still alive." She led him to the long couch by the window and made him sit. Only then did she notice how badly his hand had been damaged. The polished plating around 2 fingers was scorched almost black. She fetched a medkit, crouched before him with senatorial grace forgotten, and worked in careful silence for a while, cleaning burns and checking articulation. Her tenderness was a skill equal to diplomacy and often more effective. Under it, the hardest-held parts of him began to unfasten. "I almost did it," he said quietly. "I almost killed Dooku because he told me to." Padme did not look up. "But you didn't. Because Dooku spoke first. Because some part of you still stopped." He wanted to argue, to insist that morality deserved more credit when it was proactive, and less when it was merely interrupted. Instead, he watched her hands. She was not Jedi. She had no orders, no counsels, no doctrines about detachment or serenity. Yet she was the one person in the galaxy before whom he never wanted to become less than the best shape of himself. "If Dooku speaks publicly," she said after a while, "there will be chaos." Palpatine had too much power wrapped around too many institutions. People won't know whether to cling to what's left or burn all of it. He's going to use the truth. Yes. He doesn't deserve to. "No," Padme said. "People rarely deserve the tools history gives them." Across the city, in chambers less beautiful and more honest, Dooku was already doing precisely that. The shuttle from the invisible hand reached a reserve flagship beyond the main battle envelope and transferred him at once to a secure command suite. Medical droids fussed over his burns until he drove them away with cold disgust. Grievous received casualty reports from surviving flotilla commanders and punctuated them with intermittent vows to skin Jedi alive. Tactical droids requested clarification on strategic posture. Newt Gunray tried 3 separate channels in 10 minutes, each carrying a different blend of panic and self-preservation. Dooku ignored them all until he had stripped off the charred outer cloak, washed blood and soot from his face, and laid out the spoils of the chamber on a black metal table. The buffer crystal. Sidious's red saber. A signet ring taken from Palpatine's hand by battle droids before the flagship had broken apart entirely. A Chancellor-level code cylinder recovered by Grievous staff from a security satchel near the audience chamber threshold. 4 small objects. Together they weighed more than most navies. He accessed the recording first. The holo projection rose from the table in wavering blue light. There was the audience chamber from the far angle, then from above, then from the column-side view he had chosen without quite knowing how vital it would become. Palpatine captive. The doors breaking. The duel. Obi-Wan's fall. Anakin's blades at Dooku's throat. Palpatine's command, kill him. Dooku watched himself look into the boy's face and speak. He watched Sidious rise. He watched the entire architecture of hidden power reveal itself in one chamber while the galaxy burned outside. The recording was devastating. It was also, in raw form, too honest. There were lines no public needed to hear about Tyrannus, about Camino, about Dooku's own proximity to crimes now best redistributed among the dead and the structurally guilty. Truth, to remain effective in politics, required editing no less than falsehood did. Dooku took no pleasure in the necessity. He merely acknowledged it and summoned a data technician. When the moon arrived trembling, Dooku said, "You will produce 3 cuts of this recording. 1 complete for my private archive. 1 restricted for selected system leaders. 1 public. In the public cut, remove references that clarify my operational role beyond the fact that I opposed Sidious in the end. Leave intact the command to execute. Leave intact the self-revelation. Leave intact the death." Now, the moon swallowed. "My lord, that will destabilize the Republic beyond." "Yes," Dooku said. "That is the point." He dismissed the technician and looked out toward the stars where Corasont hid beyond battle haze and distance. He thought of Anakin in whatever room he had fled to, carrying shame he had not quite earned. He thought of Obi-Wan bringing uncomfortable fairness to the Council. He thought of Yoda, who would understand at once that the end of one's shadow seldom meant daylight. Then he looked at Sidious's saber. In the black glass reflection beneath it, his own face looked older than it had that morning. By dawn on Sereno, the story had changed hands. Dooku preferred to speak from his own world. Not because safety there was perfect. No fortress was perfect once treachery became currency. But because place could do some of politics' work before language ever entered. The ancestral hall chosen for the transmission had ceilings high enough to dwarf ordinary vanity, and old stone dark enough to make his white hair and grave face seem almost ascetic by contrast. No Separatist banners cluttered the background. No corporate insignia. No visible army. Only the long line of house memorials cut into the walls, the severe geometry of old nobility, and a single holoscreen behind him, holding the frozen first frame of the chamber recording. He wore not Sith black, not military armor, but the formal dark attire of Sereno's ruling line. The burn along his left hand remained visible. He allowed that. Wounds authenticated. Around the hall stood a minimal staff, transmission droids, 2 human aides, 1 trusted captain from Sereno's house guard, and far back in the shadows, the mute presence of Magna Guards, with their staffs lowered like inverted standards. Grievous had argued for a more overt martial display. Dooku had overruled him. This message required gravity, not spectacle. Enough spectacle would follow on its own. He waited until every major holonet feed had accepted the signal override, until the Republic emergency channels began trying and failing to suppress it, until the Senate chamber, the Jedi temple, thousands of municipal information screens, and more private receivers than any censor could count lit with his face. Then he began. Citizens of the Republic, citizens of the Confederacy, citizens of all worlds that have suffered while others debated your worth. I am Dooku of Sereno. No title beyond that. Not Count. Not Lord. Let them remember he had once been Jedi. Let them decide what that meant. For years, he continued, this war has been presented to you as a clash between lawful government and unlawful rebellion. It was not. It was a harvest. It was engineered from above and fed from below by greed, cowardice, and hidden design. The architect of that design is dead. Nay. And, He lifted one hand. The holoscreen behind him came alive. Across the galaxy, senators, clerks, pilots, laborers, diplomats, clone officers, temple initiates, smugglers, and grieving families saw the audience chamber from Dooku's chosen angle. They saw Supreme Chancellor Palpatine bound to the chair. They saw Anakin and Obi-Wan enter. They saw the duel. They heard the command to kill a beaten opponent. They heard Dooku accuse. They saw the old man rise with impossible speed, red blade in hand, lightning in his fingers. Every public gentleness burned out of his face. They saw Darth Sidious revealed. They saw him die on the blade meant for another neck. The hall on Sereno remained silent except for the transmission hum. Dooku let the footage play long enough for disbelief to shatter itself against visual fact. Then he resumed. Palpatine and Sidious were one. He manipulated the Senate, corrupted the courts, lied to the Jedi, and steered both sides of the war toward his own elevation. Some of you will ask how I know this. I know because I stood near him long enough to understand the outline of his design, and because when he sought to discard me, he was forced into the open. Indeed. A lie braided to truth. Good enough. I killed him, Dooku said. There it was. The claim ownership required. Not boast. Statement. Ask yourselves now, what remains of the moral authority of the government that clothes such a thing in legality? Ask yourselves what remains of emergency powers granted to a dead Sith. Ask yourselves whether worlds that bled for years should simply return, heads bowed, to the same Senate machinery that nourished the deception. No. Across Corasont, the Senate erupted. In the great rotunda, senators shouted over one another while aides scrambled to confirm what every screen had already made undeniable. Bail Organa stood rigid, one hand braced on a desk rail, face pale with the kind of horror that arrived only when decency discovered how deep it had been fooled. Masameda looked not grieving, but cornered. Some delegates demanded immediate military lockdown. Others demanded the Jedi explain how a Sith had ruled from under their noses. Still others, especially those from worlds long abused by both tax and war, simply stared at Dooku as though treason had learned to sound briefly like honesty. Padme watched from her private office complex with a small cluster of trusted staff. When the edited recording reached the moment of Anakin's blades at Dooku's throat and Palpatine's eager command, her breath caught. Dooku had left that in on purpose. Of course he had. It implicated the dead Chancellor and humiliated the living Jedi who had hesitated. It transformed Anakin into a symbol of innocence nearly corrupted by executive power. It made the whole Republic look fevered. Brilliant bastard, she murmured. Anakin, in a temple chamber not far from the council hall, watched the same moment with his face gone hard as forged metal. Shame rose in him hot and immediate, followed by rage that Dooku would use the instant publicly, followed by the colder recognition that if Dooku had cut the truth to wound, the original wound still belonged to Palpatine. Obi-Wan stood beside him, arms folded inside his sleeves. He's choosing his facts carefully, Obi-Wan said. Yes. That doesn't make them cease to be facts. Anakin turned away from the screen. I know. In the council chamber, Mace Windu killed the transmission only after it had done its damage. He looked around at gathered masters and found no refuge in their faces from the obvious. The Senate will fracture by noon, he said. Before noon, said CZ. They may ask us to take emergency control, Mace said. Or accuse us of plotting to. Either serves, Dooku. Yoda's expression was unreadable in the old, deep way of someone who had seen institutions rise, ossify, and break before most species learned language. Fear makes eager servants, he said. To safety, to vengeance, to certainty. Offer all three, Dooku now does. And what do we offer? Mace asked. Yoda looked toward the city, where traffic still flowed around the wound of the crashed flagship, and the Senate dome caught morning on its curve like a blade catching light. The truth, he said. Then, after a pause heavy enough to make several masters shift, late it is, but truth. Naim, Nadia, Dadasha, Al-Nazi, Wan, Cho. On Camino, the transmission was watched in secret by technicians who immediately began denying knowledge they had once buried under contracts. In Outer Rim garrisons, clone commanders exchanged wary glances over private channels, wondering what hidden command architecture Dooku's half-spoken insinuation referred to. On Separatist worlds exhausted by blockade and tribute, citizens watched with the dangerous relief of people told at last that the nightmare had a face, and that face was dead. On Sereno, Dooku pressed advantage. "I do not ask the galaxy to trust me blindly," he said, which was an excellent sentence because it sounded humble while conceding nothing. "I ask it to see clearly. The Confederacy of Independent Systems was infiltrated and manipulated, as was the Republic. Yet one fact stands above the debris. The old order cannot simply be restored by pretending the disease was a single man. It was a structure that permitted secrecy, concentrated emergency authority, and taught citizens to confuse order with obedience." He let that settle. He knew what many listeners would object. "You helped build this. You profited from it. You are not clean." All true. But public life was not a tribunal of souls. It was a competition of sequences. Whoever explained events first owned the terrain on which later judgment walked. "Systems willing to withdraw from central corruption," Dooku said, "will find the Confederacy prepared to negotiate security, trade, and self-governance without Sith coercion. Systems wishing neutrality will be granted hearing. This war was made by deception. Its end, if there is wisdom left in us, can be made by revelation." He ended there. Not with threat. Not with triumph. With an invitation sharpened into inevitability. When the transmission died, the hull on Sereno remained still for several breaths. The aides did not know whether to congratulate him. The guards did not know whether history had just been rescued or murdered. Dooku spared them all the burden of pretending certainty. "Prepare private channels to Onderon, Mandalore. The banking clan directors and every neutral block we have courted in the last year," he said. "I want separate messages tailored to each. Also, to the governors of worlds, whose representatives oppose the Military Creation Act. Fear and vindication have different languages." No. The aides hurried. One remained long enough to ask, voice carefully controlled. "My lord, do you believe the Jedi will answer with force?" Dooku considered. "Some will answer with conscience," he said. "Some with fear dressed as caution. Some with the naive hope that exposure alone restores legitimacy. The Council will divide before it decides anything visible. That is their tragedy. They are at their most morally articulate, exactly when speed punishes deliberation." And Senator Amidala? It pleased him that the aide had named her. Padme mattered. A conscience inside politics was not usually decisive, but when systems cracked, trusted voices became bridges. "She will try to build peace from wreckage," Dooku said, "which means she will be attacked from both sides almost immediately." The aide bowed and left. At last Dooku stood alone with the dead man's saber resting on the black table and morning climbing the mountains beyond the hall's high windows. Sereno's dawn was a colder thing than Coruscant's manufactured glow. It touched the stone in slow silver plains and made the old house seem less like architecture than endurance. He flexed his burned hand once. Pain answered. Honest and immediate. Sidious was dead. The truth of it still moved strangely in him. Not joy. Not freedom. Freedom was for men without obligations or appetites. Dooku had both. He had killed a master, but killing a master did not abolish mastery as a temptation. Somewhere in the dark center of himself, the part the Jedi had named dangerous and the Sith had named useful, he could already feel a new shape assembling. Not servant, not placeholder, not aging instrument, but sovereign architect. The idea came not as a shout, but as a low persuasive current. You alone know the whole fraud. You alone have the leverage to reorder what remains. You alone can make something disciplined from chaos. He was wise enough to know that this voice lied. He was proud enough to find the lie attractive anyway. On a side screen, muted, the Senate rotunda continued boiling. In another window, preliminary reports mapped fleet movements already changing under the pressure of uncertainty. A third showed the scar across Corasont where the invisible hand had come down. Somewhere below all of it, Anakin carried hurt that could still be turned. Obi-Wan carried fairness that would complicate vengeance. Yoda carried age enough to recognize the danger and perhaps not enough time to prevent it. Grievous wanted blood. The corporations wanted safety. The Republic wanted to believe the rot had died with one old man. The galaxy wanted simple endings. It would get none. Dooku lifted Sidious's saber and weighed it in his hand. An ugly weapon, really. Too eager to declare itself. He set it down again. Tyrannus died on that ship, he said aloud to the empty hall. The stone, being old and well-trained, offered no opinion. Outside, the mountains of Sereno took full morning at last, their ridgelines brightening like blades drawn slowly from velvet. Dooku stood in the new light with his burned hand beside the dead Sith's weapon, and listened to the machinery of a civilization begin to slip its old chain, only to reach, hungrily and in confusion, for another.